Oh, high expectations. Great, thanks. Plenty of seats up front if anybody wants to come up front. Okay, well, Dr. Ben Goff sends his apologies. He got sick this morning and swore up and down that we didn't want to see him. So I am going to try to give his talk. And I am a weed person. My shirt says weed science. All of my shirts say weed science. I study weeds for a reason. I do not study cows for a reason. So I apologize in advance if I butcher um, his intention with the slides, but we'll try to get through this. I know there are a few experts in the room that can correct me if I'm wrong here. So we're going to talk about, or sorry, I'm going to talk about opportunities for improved management and utilization of cover crops through grazing and using for forage. So these first few sets of slides are from Dr. Goff. So benefits of cover crops in general to grain systems. Reducing soil erosion. So providing, especially in our summer annual crop systems, corn, soybean, tobacco is a big one for us here in Kentucky. Providing cover for soil during that winter period, late fall, and early spring especially. Improving soil health and water quality. So adding carbon to the soil, providing residue, and helping to clean up our water as it moves through the soil as well. Conserving soil moisture, so providing residue that can reduce evaporative losses during these summer annual crops, especially as they're getting established. Can use, even though corn, for example, is a warm season crop, it can also benefit from some cooler temperatures early on. And then also through reducing input costs. So if we're using legumes, those legumes can be providing nutrients, nitrogen to the soil. I'm going to talk about the benefits of cover crops to weed management a little bit later on. So reducing the use of or herbicide input costs is a big way that cover crops can contribute. And so for this audience in particular, we want to know though how this can impact livestock producers. So if you look at first glance, Ben just picked these 4 states as a quick example. If you look at the total acreage data published by NASS, the number or percentage of acres strictly devoted to forages seems to be pretty small. So Illinois, just flashing up, is mostly corn and soybeans, as is Indiana. Kentucky is the only one here that has a pretty high percentage strictly devoted to pasture and forages. So Illinois, for example, only has 3.2% devoted to pasture and just under 2% devoted to hay. But then if you look at the total number of farms that have some forages, it's a really different story. So upwards of almost 60% in Illinois then of farms have some land devoted to pasture or forage production. And in Kentucky, we've got 66% of our farms that have some pasture and just under 60% that have some forage production as well. So a lot of farms are producing some of these crops in addition to their grain crops. So a lot of opportunities for integrated systems in the US. And with the interest in cover crops, and hopefully, as we start to reintegrate some of these systems, more opportunities to come. So benefits of these cover crops, we touched on benefits to grain crops. What about these integrated crop and livestock systems? So hopefully, if they are integrated, the benefits to grain systems will be similar. But to the to the livestock or the forage component, there might be additional benefits for soil health, but especially this part, and Dr. Schultz touched on this, but extending the capability of extending the grazing season is a really big potential benefit. So improving animal gains during this tough time of year, and he showed a few examples of how these plants that are in the field can be better quality than things that are cut. And then potentially the opportunity to improve weed control benefits through rotating our perennial forages with our annual corn and soybean crops that'll have different weed management tools, i.e. different herbicides. So I'm going to introduce this trial now. This is a trial that Ben and I are working on with Bob Pierce, who is our tobacco extension specialist. So we are looking at kind of a tobacco forage double crop system. So tobacco is a little bit of a specialty crop for us. It's relatively high value. So we have a couple different planting dates with tobacco too, so there's a little bit more flexibility for extending that forage production season, extending the amount of time that we can grow these cover/forage crops. So in this trial, we're looking at 2 different mixtures of cover crops. So we have rye and crimson clover. So this is cereal rye, not annual ryegrass, but cereal rye, and wheat plus crimson clover. So 2 different mixtures, both that have a legume in them. And we planted these after tobacco in 2016. So this is actually a 3-year trial that we're doing. So we planted tobacco in 2016. We established the forage/cover crops in that fall. Did all of our treatments into the spring of 2017 that I'll discuss. Planted tobacco again in 2017 and are currently now in our 2nd cycle of this cover crop and forage plantings. And we'll follow it up with the last year of tobacco in 2018. For those of you unfamiliar with tobacco, you can grow it usually 3 years before the diseases start to accumulate and you need to rotate out. And a common rotation is to rotate to a fescue pasture for a few years. Hopefully I have that right. I see some nodding. Close enough. All right. Western part of the state, it's getting more common to rotate to some grain crops. Anyways, okay. Herbicide, okay. Anyways, moving on. So treatments imposed on these cover crop mixtures / forage mixtures that we have. So we have 2 treatments where we treat them as cover crops. We kill them relatively early relative to the tobacco planting, or we kill them late. And by late, I mean like a couple, maybe less than a week before we're planting the crop. And so we're treating these as cover crops, so we're leaving all of the residue on the soil. This is strip-tilled tobacco, and tobacco is planted on 40-inch rows. So we've got maybe an 8 to 10-inch band there that we're tilling, and then we've got a pretty big between row area there where all of that mulch is sitting on the soil surface. We have 2 grazing treatments that we've imposed with actual cows. Yes, this is very exciting. So we have a rotationally grazed treatment where we graze them throughout the winter depending on the amount of forage that's produced. And this past year we grazed each of those plots twice. Each of those treatments were grazed twice. And then we have a mob grazing at the end. There's also different stocking density in these 2 treatments. So the rotationally grazed one has a much lower, I think about 1/3 of the stocking density as the mob grazed one. And you'll see a couple pictures of this. And then we have one where we're cutting all of the residue off and just removing it. Like you were going to cut it and take it out and feed it. And then we also, what's not mentioned in this slide is that we have 2 different planting times. So we planted an early tobacco that was harvested earlier so we could plant the cover crops earlier too. And so that is a bit of a benefit for the legume. So you get that clover established early, better chance of it getting going through the winter and surviving our winters, which this year have actually been, I'll say, a winter. And then we have a later one that gets planted later. It's a longer tobacco growing season, so we don't typically plant the cover crops until mid-October, which is kind of a little bit pushing it for us for crimson clover. And then we're using our animals as just grazers in here. We're not measuring the gain in the animals, so keep that in mind. So just in terms of the biomass, the forage yield that's produced, the available forage yield that produced, we do get a little bit more than you guys get in Ohio. Probably because we're a little bit warmer than Ohio. And last winter, arguably, it didn't get that cold. We had a pretty warm winter, a pretty mild winter, I'll say. So our rye and crimson clover mixture produced 7,000 to 8,000 pounds of available forage yield per acre. And the early and late planted, this is in our rotationally grazed treatment, again, grazed twice. The early and late planting yielded about the same. For the mob grazing, about 7 to 9. 7 for the earlier planted. This is the wheat, correction. Wheat, rotationally grazed. Earlier planting about 7,000 pounds, the later planting about 9,000 pounds. So converting that to tons per acre, the rye averaged about 4, the wheat early was about 3.5, and the late wheat was 4.5. Am I converting that right? It's just the same, 2,000 pounds to a ton. Okay. So for our rotationally grazed, we produced, from what I understand, a decent amount of available forage. The mob grazing, we produced more than the rotational grazing, about 5 tons in the rye, regardless of when it was planted, and 5 tons for the late wheat as well. The early wheat did not produce as much. in the mob grazing. And so Ben calculated out our grazing days per acre with the following assumptions down here that you might not be able to read. But it's assuming 2 cows, 1,200 pounds each, with a 3% daily intake, and then 60% utilization in the rotational grazing, 70% utilization in the mob grazing. And so you can see the grazing days per acre up here. Again, remember this is for 2 cows. I think Mark gave his for 1. But so we're averaging around 60 to 70 for the rotational grazing, and for the rye and for the late planted wheat, around 90 days in the mob grazing, and around 65 for the early planted wheat in here. So from what I understand from Ben, he assumed a slightly lower utilization for the mob grazing because we didn't have that great efficient grazing efficiency in our mob grazing. They mostly just trampled it down in that treatment. So he wanted to make the point that managing this for forages versus managing it for a grain crop, you might have different goals. So if you were managing this like you wanted a bunch of cover crop residue to, say, suppress your weeds or to keep your soil in place during those heavy spring rains, you might want something that looks a little bit more like this than like this, where it's really cut pretty clean and close to the surface. So in that case, the mob grazing might be a slightly better option for you. And we also went through and measured the amount of residue that was left on the soil surface about 5 weeks after we planted the tobacco. And I'll have some pictures of what the soil looks like in these different treatments. And so to walk you through this figure, we've got our 5 different utilization treatments here on this axis. Our 2 grazing treatments here on the left, and rye is shown in the blue and the wheat is shown in the red. And the higher the bars is the more residue that's left about 5 weeks after we planted here. And the grazing treatments, the mob, especially so for the rye, did have more residue left than the rotationally grazed ones, and pretty much on par with treating it as a cover crop and leaving all of the residue there. So in terms of the animal gain, remember we didn't collect any data on this. So we were just looking at how this was going to influence our weed management, our tobacco yield, and a couple of other different parameters. So observational things. So the stage of growth is still primarily determinant of nutritive value animal gains. Okay. So the rotationally grazed treatments were still in their vegetative stage when they were grazed. So that was going to increase their nutritive value, which is likely going to lead to higher gains, is what the point is there. Okay. By the time we did mob graze everything, they had already gone reproductive and were flowering. So grazing at those mature stages did lead to a lot of trampling. So that's where you saw a lot more residue was left in the mob grazing especially. But regardless of grazing method, the later we went, the more trampling we had as opposed to removal through grazing. So early utilization, we thought might increase the concentration of the legume, and we have data collected on the biomass that's left of both the clover and the grain at each of these stages. But so just looking at pictures though, here's one of our mixes prior to grazing here on the left. And then after a little bit of regrowth on the right here, you can see that opening up that canopy, or grazing really did open up that canopy, and we think led to more growth of that legume in the rotational grazing treatments. So this is an interesting, you can think about the nitrogen content that's going to come from the second grazing here might be higher. And so we're still trying to look through all of these samples that we have to determine if that was the case. And then in terms of the 2 different species that we had in here, the wheat plus crimson clover or the cereal rye plus crimson clover, when we first turned the cows out into this, at first they saw the rye, it had higher biomass, and they were like, ooh, this looks better, and they all ran over there. But then they kind of ate it a little bit, and then they all walked over to the wheat. And so they really had a clear preference for the wheat, and this picture shows that quite nicely. This white line here is just drawn on this picture. This is a wheat plot side right adjacent to a rye plot, and that cow is just standing in the rye saying, oh, I wish there was some more wheat left for me to eat, but I already ate it all. Now I have to eat this. So yes, in more appropriate language, there is a clear difference in palatability between species, which influences intake and forage utilization. They did prefer the wheat over the rye. Okay, so other opportunities to control weeds in the forage with crop rotation with these summer annual crops, like corn and soybeans, is, in Ben's opinion, an underappreciated aspect of these integrated systems. So one of the limitations with forage can be the increases in perennial weeds. And if you've got these mixtures of grass and legumes, you have very few herbicide options that can take those out in those mixed assemblages. So grain crops, if you've ever looked at our herbicide books, we've got a lot more herbicide options in corn and soybeans than you all do for those mixed stands. So we might have some options. Rotating with those corn and soybeans can maybe give you better control of these perennial weeds. Sorry. And now that I spent so much time on Ben's talk, I don't have time to talk about my own stuff, but I was going to talk about weed control. So how these different forage utilizations influence weed control in our summer annual crops. So what I normally do is study how cover crops influence weeds. They're great for weed control. In corn and soybeans, a lot of my work focuses on mare's tail. Who deals with mare's tail? Horseweed. It's a bad weed. Cover crops help with it. End of story. Cover crops also help suppress summer annual weeds emerging in corn and soybeans, and tobacco as well. But a lot of that suppression is driven by that above ground residue producing a mulch layer. So if you take that off, like you're going to feed it or you graze it, what happens to the weed suppressive potential? Especially important as we start dealing with wanting to use cover crops to manage herbicide resistant weeds. So seeing that in pictures, this flops down on the soil surface, becomes a mulch layer that can physically suppress weeds, chemically tie up nitrogen between our crop rows, suppress weeds. If you cut all that off, like you're going to feed it, you don't have any residue left there between the rows, what happens? So I'll talk about the trial that I just talked about. Actually, I'll flip to it now, because basically it produced some strange results that aren't necessarily quite so easy to understand. So what we thought would happen, backing up here is some attractive photos that the ag communication staff came out and took of this massively huge trial that we conducted. So again, we've got our 2 species, wheat and rye, our 5 different utilization treatments. So early killed cover crop, not much residue. Late killed cover crop, lots of residue, thicker mulch layer. 2 different kinds of grazing, removing all residue. And then for weed management in our tobacco crop, we're heavily reliant on soil residual herbicides and cultivation, which often in tobacco, especially if you're trying to do it reduced tillage like we were, means doing it with a hoe. So we used Spartan Charge, which is a combination of 2 different active ingredients that have residual activity, hand hoeing, and then one of the few herbicides that tobacco growers can apply after the crop is already up, but it only kills grasses. So what we expected to find is that any time where we had all of this biomass and that really thick mulch layer, we thought, okay, well, that's going to suppress weeds. We're going to have fewer weeds there. Any place where we had these cows remove all of that residue, we thought, okay, well, assuming our herbicides are effective, we should have similar levels of weed control in there. And probably where the cattle have come through and grazed, we're going to find similar levels of weeds to where we remove the biomass for hay. And that was sometimes the case, but sometimes not the case. So I kind of threw this slide up there and like, well, we still have some work to do in trying to figure out these data. So here's the red bars here represent weed density in our plots where we have the thickest mulch layer. And then our 2 grazing treatments are over here on the right in these green and blue bars. And then the The removal for hay is in this orange bar in the middle here. And so depending when we planted, so if we're talking our early planted tobacco or our later planted stuff, we have a lot of differences, where we can have differences in weed density. But in terms of relative between our two types of grazing, no differences resulting in weed density from either compaction or differences in the residue remaining that you saw from Ben's slide earlier. But interesting, though, that we do have differences in weed density resulting from those two grazing treatments and the removal. Early planted tobacco, we have more weeds in the grazed than in the removal. Later planted, smaller difference, but more weeds in the removal than we did in the rotational graze and in the grazing treatments. So lots of things that we need to figure out here related to weather, the rainfall, and the timing, and all of these things. You might ask me what happened to yield. We just got the tobacco stripped right before Christmas because we had such a dry fall. So still analyzing those data. So I'll just I do have another trial that I was going to talk about where we use herbicides and we don't use herbicides. And that part there where we're not using our soil residual herbicides is the part that's a little bit more applicable to growers, maybe for corn and soybean systems, where reliance on soil residual herbicides, so these are the ones that keep your weeds from coming up in the first place, is maybe not so high. So growers that are using what we call post-emergence or foliar herbicides, so herbicides that are used to kill weeds once they're already emerged, are really more reliant on suppressing weeds from that residue in the first place. And so I do have another trial where we're looking at how these things suppress weeds without using the herbicides, whether or not we're intercepting herbicides with those residues, because that can be a danger if you've got that really thick mulch layer there. If you spray an herbicide that's meant to get down, work its way into the soil, maybe that mulch layer can intercept that herbicide. We haven't found any evidence of that in our research yet. It's more of a danger if you've got really dry conditions after you've applied that herbicide. But in the interest of time, I'll skip over that part. But you're welcome to ask me that after the session ends. So in most cases, though, removing this biomass for forage, it turns out, doesn't really negatively impact your weed management if you are using soil residual herbicides. And it turns out from our other trial that removing the biomass, though, does, in the absence of herbicides, can increase weed density, increase the biomass of your weeds. So if you are relying just on those foliar products, would be something to pay attention to. From our other grazing the crops, from 1 year of data, impacts on weeds are kind of dependent on planting date, but we do have that interesting difference where grazing versus removal for hay or removal for forage seems to result in differences depending on what part of the season we're looking in. And forage removal, we've seen in a couple of our trials, might actually help improve crop establishment. And so crop competitiveness is one of the major factors in suppressing weeds, regardless of whether it's tobacco, soybeans, corn, cotton, peanuts, cabbages, what have you. So if you're going to be using herbicides and you're going to be managing your weeds well with herbicides, and planting any crop into that much residue can be difficult. So in this case, removing that residue, removing that biomass for forage might actually be an advantage. And as a weed scientist, I do want to provide this cautionary tale, because this is going to be something that as we start to graze in between these summer annual crops is going to become more and more important, and hopefully something that will become more and more addressed by companies. But the weed management program in these summer annual crops can have an influence on what you can do, not only on the establishment and the growth of the species of cover crops and forage species, but also on what you can legally do by that. Remember, your herbicide label is the law. So if you want to be grazing or feeding biomass, you do need to check the labels of herbicides that were applied within that year, maybe even the year before. Label language is going to vary by quite a bit. Some of them are really specific. So Command is a common tobacco herbicide that says, do not graze or harvest for food or feed cover crops planted less than 9 months after treatment. So if you applied Command in your tobacco in May or June, planted a cover crop that fall, you could not graze that cover crop. A couple of online resources that have been published just within the last year or so. There is one from Iowa State and Nebraska, and this is just specific to this topic. The University of Kentucky has some really great publications on the use of herbicides in corn and soybeans and in forages too, but specific to this topic, grazing options. I did want to point out these two. And if you need the most up-to-date herbicide labels as well, this website is free and searchable for herbicide labels. And with that, I think I saved just a couple minutes for questions, if anybody has any questions. I can show more data if... Yes, sir. So you're asking if you can get early stunting in your crop plants following cover crops, especially cover crops that are let go until they're more mature. Yes, you can. And so nutrient management following especially small grain cover crops is really important. So the small grains, especially as they get more mature, they have a lot of carbon in them. So as they die, as they decompose, they're tying up a lot of nitrogen in your soil. So that can be one way that one reason that plants can be stunted after when you plant them into more mature cover crop stands. So one way you can alleviate that is by, if your rotation allows, using some legumes in the mix. You can also, depending on the crop, add some additional nitrogen to get them started. There also, though, can be some disease, insect issues that you need to watch out for. So normally, we recommend leaving a good solid 2 weeks between killing the cover crop and planting cash crops to so you don't have cutworm issues, some of the seedling diseases like Pythium and Rhizoctonia that can be problematic following them. But there's a lot of interest now in planting green and really pushing that window, shortening that up quite a bit. And so making sure if you're gonna do that, keeping an eye on things and coming in with inputs, let's just say, if you think that you're developing an insect or disease problem. But normally the advice is to give it a good 2, if not 3 weeks. And then, lastly, I'll just mention soil temperature too. Is a big concern. So the farther north you go, the earlier you try to plant. The residues, since they're inhibiting evaporation, are also keeping the soil cooler. So it's usually either nutrients, diseases or insects, or soil temperature, or a combination of all of those. What did I miss? Yeah, so it can, yes, you can have early season stunting, some of which are easier to manage than others. Okay.